The morning sun stretched across the Harrison ranch like a golden blanket. But Robert, Bobby Harrison, couldn't find any warmth in it. He stood on the weathered porch of the farmhouse his grandfather had built in 1947, staring at the envelope in his hands. The return address from First National Bank of Fredericksburg felt like a death sentence printed in neat corporate font. 78 years, 3 generations, all about to disappear in 90 days. Bobby's calloused fingers trembled as he opened the foreclosure notice for the 3rd time that morning, as if the words might somehow rearrange themselves into something less devastating. The numbers hadn't changed. $247,000 in accumulated debt, compounded by years of drought, veterinary emergencies, and the cruel mathematics of modern farming that favored corporate operations over family ranches. Dad? He turned to see his daughter Jennifer standing in the doorway, still in her pajamas despite it being past 7. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and the worry lines around her eyes had deepened over the past 6 months. At 32, she looked older than she should, worn down by double shifts at Fredericksburg Elementary School and weekend waitressing at the German bakery in town. "You're up early," Bobby said, folding the letter and stuffing it into his back pocket. "Thought you'd sleep in on a Saturday." "Heard you moving around at 5, Jennifer said, stepping onto the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. She handed him one, the steam curling up into the cool November air. "Another letter?" Bobby nodded, unable to meet her eyes. The hill country stretched before them, 420 acres of land that had sustained 3 generations of Harrisons. The native live oaks stood like ancient sentinels along the property line, their gnarled branches reaching toward a sky that hadn't delivered meaningful rain in 18 months. The pastures where his grandfather had raised cattle now sat mostly empty, the herd reduced from 200 head to 43 after last year's devastating bacterial infection. 90 days, he finally said, his voice rough. "They're giving us 90 days. Jennifer's hand tightened around her mug, but she didn't cry. She'd stopped crying weeks ago, after the bank rejected their 3rd loan modification request. "We'll figure something out." "Jenny, there's nothing left to figure." Bobby took a long sip of coffee, bitter and black, the way he'd drunk it for 40 years. "I've sold everything I can sell. The equipment's mortgaged. The cattle won't fetch enough at auction. Your brother won't return my calls." The mention of David landed between them like a stone. Jennifer's older brother had left for Houston 8 years ago after a bitter argument with Bobby about the ranch's future. David had wanted to sell portions of the land to developers, to modernize, to stop living in the past, as he'd shouted that final night. Bobby had refused, and David had driven away in his truck at midnight, leaving tire marks in the gravel driveway, and a silence that had lasted nearly a decade. "I'll call him again," Jennifer said quietly. "He needs to know what's happening. He made his choice." Bobby set his mug on the porch railing, gripping the wood so hard his knuckles turned white. This place, this legacy, it didn't matter to him then. Why would it matter now? Before Jennifer could respond, the sound of tires on gravel drew their attention. A dusty Ford pickup pulled into the driveway, and Bobby recognized it immediately. Charles Whitmore, his nearest neighbor and oldest friend, climbed out slowly, his 70-year-old frame moving with the deliberate caution of someone who'd broken too many bones over too many decades of ranch work. "Bobby," Charles called, walking toward the porch with his characteristic bow-legged gait. "Got a minute?" "Always got time for you, Charlie," Bobby said, though his stomach clenched. Good news didn't arrive at 7 in the morning. Charles climbed the porch steps, nodding at Jennifer. "Morning, Jenny. You look prettier every time I see you." "You're a terrible liar, Mr. Whitmore," Jennifer said with a small smile, "but I appreciate the effort." Charles chuckled, but it died quickly as he turned to Bobby. His weathered face, tanned the color of saddle leather, carried an expression Bobby had seen before. The look men in their community wore when delivering bad news they wished they didn't have to share. "Heard about the foreclosure," Charles said simply. "Bank manager's wife goes to my church. Word's getting around town." Bobby felt heat rise in his cheeks, shame mixing with anger. "Of course it is. People want to help, Bobby. The Richters, the Kleins, even the Hendersons said they'd pitch in if you organized something. Maybe a benefit auction or—" "No." The word came out harder than Bobby intended. "I appreciate it, Charlie. I do. But I'm not taking charity. This is my mess to clean up. It's not charity. It's community. That's what we do out here." I said no. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant caw of a crow and the whisper of wind through the oak trees. Charles studied Bobby for a long moment, then sighed. "Your pride's going to bury you, Bobby Harrison. Same pride that's kept you from calling your son, I reckon." Bobby's jaw tightened. "That's different." "Is it?" Charles shook his head. "I've known you since you were in diapers. Watched you grow up on this land. Your daddy would be spinning in his grave to see you give up without fighting with everything you've got, including your damn pride." "My father's not here," Bobby said coldly. "And this isn't his problem anymore. It's mine." Charles looked like he wanted to say more, but Jennifer stepped forward, her hand gentle on her father's shoulder. "Thank you for coming by, Mr. Whitmore. We really do appreciate it." The old rancher nodded, understanding the dismissal for what it was. "Y'all know where I am if you need anything. Anything at all." He paused at the top of the porch steps, glancing back. "Bobby, losing land doesn't mean losing legacy. Your family's legacy is in you and your kids. Don't forget that." They watched him drive away, dust trailing behind his truck like a fading ghost. When the sound of his engine disappeared, Jennifer turned to her father. "He's right, you know." "Jenny." "No, Dad. Listen to me." Her voice carried a strength that made Bobby finally look at her. "This pride thing, this idea that accepting help makes you weak, it's killing you. It's killing us. I've been working 70-hour weeks trying to help, and you won't even let me contribute to the mortgage payments. You won't reach out to David. You won't let the community do what communities are supposed to do. I won't be pitied." "It's not pity." Jennifer's voice rose, frustration breaking through her usual calm. "It's love. It's respect. People in this town remember when Grandpa Harrison gave them work during the recession. They remember when you donated beef to the food bank every Christmas. They remember when this ranch hosted the church picnic every year. You think they've forgotten all that?" Bobby turned away, staring out at the land that had defined his entire existence. Every fence post, every gate, every tree held a memory. His father teaching him to ride when he was 4. His mother's garden, long overgrown now, where she'd grown the tomatoes that won ribbons at the county fair. The creek where he'd proposed to his wife Linda, God rest her soul, under a full moon in 1986. "I'm 58 years old," he said quietly. "I've spent 40 of those years working this land, trying to honor what my father and grandfather built. And I've failed them, Jenny. I've failed all of them. You haven't failed anyone." Jennifer moved to stand beside him, her shoulder touching his. "The economy failed. The drought failed. The banks failed. But you're still here, still fighting. That's not failure." Bobby wanted to believe her, but the letter in his pocket felt like proof otherwise. A legal document, declaring in precise terms exactly how thoroughly he'd failed to protect his family's legacy. The rest of the day passed in a haze of necessary work. Bobby checked on the remaining cattle, repaired a broken water line near the southern pasture, and avoided looking at the empty spaces where equipment used to sit, before he'd sold it piece by piece. Jennifer disappeared into town, claiming she needed groceries, but Bobby suspected she was making calls, trying to work miracles he didn't believe in anymore. By evening, exhaustion pulled at his bones. He sat in his father's old recliner in the living room, surrounded by 3 generations of family photos covering every wall. His grandfather in his Army uniform, 1943. His father accepting an award from the Texas Cattlemen's Association, 1979. His wedding photo, Linda radiant in white lace, both of them so young and full of hope. And there, in a small frame on the bookshelf, a picture he hadn't looked at in years. Bobby, 26 years old, standing next to a lanky 23-year-old with a guitar case slung over his shoulder. Both of them were grinning, arms around each other's shoulders, standing in front of the barn that still stood behind the house. George Strait. Before the fame, before the millions of records sold, before becoming the king of country music. Back when he was just a guy trying to make it, playing honky-tonks and dive bars around Central Texas, working day jobs to pay for gas and guitar strings. Bobby picked up the photo, memory flooding back with startling clarity. It was 1977, late summer, and George had been playing at a bar in San Marcos with his band Ace in the Hole. Bobby had been there with friends, young and cocky, flush with a successful cattle sale. After the show, he'd bought George a beer, and they'd talked for hours about music, ranching, dreams, and the uncertain future both of them faced. George had been honest about his struggles. The band was good, getting better, but money was tight. He was working odd jobs, trying to save enough to get to Nashville, to cut a proper demo that might catch someone's attention. He had the talent. Anyone who heard him sing knew that. But talent without opportunity was just potential dying on the vine. Bobby had made a decision that night that seemed insane to his friends, but felt absolutely right to him. He'd offered George work on the Harrison Ranch, real work, good pay, and a place to stay in the old bunkhouse his grandfather had built. For 6 months, George had worked the ranch during the day and played music at night, saving every penny he could. They'd become friends, real friends, sharing early morning coffee and late-night conversations about life, family, and what it meant to chase a dream. When George had finally saved enough to make his trip to Nashville, Bobby had added to it $3,000, a fortune in 1977, pressed into George's hand with a firm handshake and simple words. Go make something of yourself. Pay me back when you're playing the Grand Ole Opry. George had left in March 1978, promising to stay in touch. And he had, for a while. Postcards from Nashville. A phone call when he landed his first recording contract with MCA Records in 1981. A letter when his first single, Unwound, hit the charts. But as George's star rose, the communication naturally faded. Life moved forward. Bobby married Linda, started a family, threw himself into running the ranch. George became a household name, one of the most successful country artists of all time. Bobby had never asked for the money back. It hadn't been a loan in his mind, not really. It had been an investment in a friend's dream. And watching George succeed had been payment enough. Over the years, he'd followed the career from a distance, buying albums, watching performances on television, feeling a quiet pride that he'd played some small part in helping George get started. Now, holding that photograph in his failing living room, Bobby wondered what had happened to that young man who'd been generous enough to help a struggling musician. When had he become so rigid, so proud, so unable to accept the help he'd once freely given? Jennifer found him there an hour later, the photo still in his hands, tears streaming down his face in the dim lamplight. "Dad?" She knelt beside the recliner, alarmed. "What's wrong?" Bobby handed her the photograph. "I used to be better than this," he whispered. "I used to believe in helping people, in taking chances, in community. When did I lose that?" Jennifer studied the photo, recognition dawning. "Is that George Strait? Long time ago. Before he was George Strait. Before he was anybody." Bobby wiped his eyes roughly. "He worked here for 6 months. I helped him get to Nashville, never asked for anything in return. I never knew that. It was a lifetime ago, Jenny. Different world. Different man." Bobby leaned back in the recliner, suddenly feeling every one of his 58 years. That man wouldn't have been too proud to accept help from his neighbors. That man wouldn't have let his son disappear from his life. That man knew what really mattered. Jennifer was quiet for a moment, then said, "That man is still in there, Dad. You haven't lost him. You're just scared. And that's okay. Anyone would be scared." "I'm terrified," Bobby admitted, the word catching in his throat. "This land is all I have, all I know. Without it, who am I? You're my father. You're David's father. You're a man who helped a stranger chase his dream. You're Bobby Harrison. And that means something regardless of how many acres you own." Bobby pulled his daughter into a hug, holding tight to the one thing he knew he'd done absolutely right in his life. Outside, night had fallen completely, and the hill country darkness was absolute, broken only by the distant stars and the single light burning on the porch. Somewhere in that darkness, Bobby's phone buzzed with a message he wouldn't see until morning. A message that would change everything. The Monday morning staff meeting at Fredericksburg Elementary dragged on with the enthusiasm of cold molasses. Jennifer sat in the back of the library, only half listening as Principal Catherine Brennan discussed standardized test schedules and updated attendance policies. Her mind kept drifting back to her father, to the defeated slump of his shoulders, to the way he'd looked at that old photograph like it held answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. "Mrs. Harrison?" Jennifer snapped back to attention, realizing Principal Brennan was looking at her expectantly. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?" "I asked if you'd be willing to coordinate the holiday food drive this year. You did such a wonderful job with the spring fundraiser." Jennifer's first instinct was to refuse. She barely had time to breathe between teaching, waitressing, and trying to keep her father from drowning in despair. But the faces of her colleagues were turned toward her with hopeful expressions, and she found herself nodding. "Of course. I'd be happy to." "Excellent." Principal Brennan made a note on her clipboard. "Let's plan to kick it off the week after Thanksgiving. We'll need—" The library door opened, interrupting her mid-sentence. Janet Rodriguez, the school secretary, poked her head in, her expression urgent. "Catherine, sorry to interrupt, but Jennifer has an important phone call." The person said it was urgent family business. Jennifer's heart dropped into her stomach. Her father. Something had happened. She was already standing, gathering her things, when Principal Brennan waved her toward the door. "Go, go. We can catch you up later." Jennifer hurried down the hallway to the main office, her mind racing through terrible possibilities. Her father had been so defeated, so lost. What if he'd done something drastic? What if— "Line 2, Janet said, pointing to the phone on the desk. "Take your time." Jennifer picked up the receiver with a shaking hand. "This is Jennifer Harrison." "Jennifer, thank God." The voice was male, unfamiliar, professional, but warm. "My name is Walter Montgomery. I'm calling from Austin. I apologize for the dramatic approach, but I needed to reach you directly. And this seemed the most efficient way." "I don't understand. Is my father okay?" "Your father is fine, as far as I know. Though I understand he's going through a difficult time." Walter paused, and Jennifer could hear papers shuffling. "I'm an attorney, Ms. Harrison. I've been retained by a client who wishes to remain anonymous for the moment. This client has learned about your family's situation regarding the Harrison Ranch. and the pending foreclosure. Jennifer's confusion deepened. How would anyone in Austin know about that? My client has connections throughout Texas, particularly in the Hill Country region. They were informed of the situation by a mutual acquaintance and asked me to reach out to you directly. Walter's voice took on a more serious tone. Ms. Harrison, my client would like to help. They've authorized me to open negotiations with First National Bank of Fredericksburg regarding the outstanding debt on the Harrison Ranch. The words didn't make sense at first, like hearing a foreign language that sounded almost familiar but remained incomprehensible. What? My client wishes to satisfy the debt in full, Ms. Harrison. They want to save your family's ranch. Jennifer sat down heavily in Janet's chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. That's almost $250,000. I'm aware of the amount. My client is prepared to handle it. But why? Who would do that? We don't know anyone with that kind of money. As I said, my client wishes to remain anonymous for now, but I can assure you this is a legitimate offer. I'll be meeting with representatives from First National Bank this afternoon to begin the process. However, I need your cooperation. And more importantly, I'll need your father's cooperation. Jennifer's mind spun. This had to be a scam, some cruel joke or elaborate con. People didn't just pay off strangers' debts. Mr. Montgomery, I appreciate the call, but this doesn't make sense. Nobody does something like this out of the goodness of their heart. You'd be surprised what people do, Ms. Harrison, when they're repaying an old kindness. Walter's voice softened. I can't share details yet. My client has specifically requested privacy until certain arrangements are finalized. But I can tell you this is real. It's happening. And your family's ranch will not be foreclosed upon. Jennifer felt tears burning in her eyes. My father won't accept this. He's too proud. He'll refuse charity, even if it means losing everything. I anticipated that might be an issue, Walter said, which is why I'm calling you first. I need you to help me understand your father, his personality, his values. What approach might help him accept this help without feeling diminished by it? For the next 20 minutes, Jennifer found herself describing her father to a complete stranger. She talked about his stubborn pride, his deep connection to the land, his sense of failure at potentially being the Harrison who lost the family legacy. She talked about her grandfather, who'd taught her father that a man stands on his own 2 feet and doesn't ask for handouts. She talked about her mother's death 5 years ago, and how something in her father had broken that day, leaving him more rigid, more isolated. Walter listened without interrupting, occasionally asking a clarifying question. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Your father sounds like a good man carrying an impossible burden, he finally said. Ms. Harrison, I want to arrange a meeting. You, your father, myself, and my client. Somewhere neutral, comfortable. Somewhere your father might be willing to listen. He won't come. Not if he knows what it's about. Then we'll be creative about the invitation. Walter's tone became businesslike again. I'll be in touch within the week with details. In the meantime, please don't mention this call to your father. Let me handle the preliminary work with the bank. When the time comes for him to know, it should come with solutions, not questions. After hanging up, Jennifer sat in the quiet office, her mind reeling. Janet had discreetly stepped out to give her privacy, and through the window she could see students heading to lunch, their laughter carrying on the November breeze. Everything looked normal, ordinary, but Jennifer felt like reality had just tilted sideways. An anonymous benefactor, $250,000. An attorney from Austin who spoke like this was all perfectly reasonable. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from her father. Truck won't start. Can you pick up feed from Henderson's on your way home? We'll pay you back. Such a small thing, asking to borrow his daughter's truck. But Jennifer knew it had cost him to send that message. Every little loss of independence cut at him like a knife. She typed back, "Of course, Dad. No rush on paying back. Love you." Then she pulled up another number she'd called 17 times in the past month, each call going to voicemail. Her brother, David's number. This time, she didn't just call. She texted, "David, it's Jenny. Something's happening. I can't explain yet, but I need you to come home. Not for me, not for the ranch. For Dad. Please. He needs both of us right now, even if he won't admit it." She hit send before she could second-guess herself, then sat staring at the phone, willing it to buzz with a response. It didn't. Meanwhile, 4 hours away in Houston, David Harrison sat in his corner office on the 23rd floor of the Langford Oil and Gas building, staring at his sister's text message. Outside his window, the Houston skyline stretched toward a hazy sky, all glass and steel and money, as far from the hill country ranch as he could get. He'd built a good life here. Started in the mailroom 8 years ago and worked his way up to regional manager. Had a nice apartment in Montrose, a girlfriend named Rachel who worked in marketing, a closet full of suits that would have made his rancher father cringe. He'd left behind the dust, the endless physical labor, the stubborn insistence on clinging to a dying way of life. But his sister's message made his chest tight. David had ignored the previous calls, telling himself it wasn't his problem anymore. His father had made his choices, and David had made his. The old man valued land over family, tradition over progress. Fine. Let him live with those choices. Except the text said, "For Dad," and David could read between the lines. Something was seriously wrong. He pulled up his contacts and scrolled to a name he hadn't called in 2 years. Charles Whitmore, the family's nearest neighbor. Charles answered on the third ring, his gravelly voice instantly recognizable. "David Harrison. Thought you'd forgotten how to dial a phone. Mr. Whitmore." David found himself reverting to the childhood formality. "I got a text from Jenny. She said something's happening with Dad. What's going on?" Charles was silent for a beat, then sighed. "Foreclosure, son. Bank's taking the ranch in 90 days. Your father's about as low as I've ever seen him, and I've known Bobby Harrison for 50 years. The words hit David like a physical blow. Foreclosure. The ranch, his grandfather's ranch, his great-grandfather's ranch, gone. Despite everything, despite the years of distance and anger, the thought made him feel like the ground had dropped away beneath his feet. How bad is the debt? $250,000, give or take. Drought, disease, bad luck, and stubbornness, all compounded. Your daddy needs help, David. Real help. But he's too damn proud to ask for it. And that pride's going to cost him everything." David stared out at the Houston skyline, seeing instead the live oak trees and rolling pastures of his childhood. "He wouldn't want me there. We haven't spoken in 8 years. Then maybe it's time to change that. Look, I don't know what happened between you two, and it's not my business. But I do know that life's too short to let pride and old arguments keep family apart, especially when that family needs you." After they hung up, David sat for a long time, his sister's text still glowing on his phone screen. His calendar showed back-to-back meetings for the rest of the week. He had a presentation to the board on Friday. Rachel had tickets to the symphony on Saturday. He pulled up her number and called. "Hey, babe," Rachel answered, her voice bright. "What's up? Aren't you in meetings? I need to go to Fredericksburg. Family emergency." "Oh no, is everyone okay?" "No," David said honestly. "No, I don't think they are." Back in Fredericksburg, Bobby Harrison stood in the barn, running his hand along the wooden stall where his father had kept his favorite horse 30 years ago. The barn was mostly empty now, echoing with absence. He'd sold the horses 2 years ago, except for Ranger, his own gelding, who was too old to fetch a decent price and too loyal to abandon. His phone had been buzzing periodically all day with calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Probably reporters or creditors, vultures circling. He'd stopped answering days ago. What he didn't know was that one of those calls had been from Walter Montgomery, attorney at law, trying to reach him before moving forward with the next phase of a plan that would change everything. What he didn't know was that at that very moment, Walter was sitting in a conference room at First National Bank, presenting a cashier's check, and a very surprised loan officer with documents to satisfy the Harrison Ranch debt in full. What he didn't know was that his son was packing a bag in Houston, preparing for a drive he'd avoided for 8 years. What he didn't know was that Jennifer was sitting in her classroom after school, crying quiet tears of hope and fear and desperate relief. And what he definitely didn't know was that George Strait, the king of country music, had spent the past week making very private phone calls and writing a very large check, remembering a young rancher who'd once believed in him enough to bet $3,000 and 6 months of work on a dream that seemed impossible. Bobby stood alone in the barn as twilight gathered, unaware that help was coming, whether he was ready to accept it or not. The call from First National Bank came on Wednesday morning while Bobby was fixing the fence on the northern property line. He almost didn't answer, seeing the bank's number flash across his screen, but something made him swipe to accept. "Mr. Harrison, this is Patricia Mendez from First National. I'm calling with some rather unusual news." Bobby's stomach clenched. They were probably accelerating the foreclosure timeline. "Just tell me straight, Patricia." "Sir, your loan has been satisfied. The full amount, paid in cash. The foreclosure proceedings have been canceled." Bobby actually looked at his phone to make sure he'd heard correctly. "What?" "I know this must be surprising. We received a visit from an attorney out of Austin yesterday, representing an anonymous client. They've paid off your entire outstanding debt, including late fees and penalties. The ranch is clear, Mr. Harrison. You own it free and clear." "That's not possible. There's been a mistake." "There's no mistake. I've verified everything twice. The money's been transferred. The paperwork is being processed. You should receive official documentation within the week. But I wanted to call you personally to let you know immediately." Bobby felt dizzy. "Who paid it?" "The client has requested anonymity. The attorney, Walter Montgomery, left his card and asked that you contact him when you're ready to discuss the details." "But, Mr. Harrison, whoever this is, they've just given you back your ranch." After the call ended, Bobby stood holding his phone, unable to process what he'd just heard. $250,000, paid anonymously. It didn't make sense. Nobody did things like that in real life. His first thought was that it was illegal somehow, money laundering or fraud. His second thought was that it was a mistake, and they'd realize it and come demanding repayment. His third thought was shame, hot and burning in his chest, that someone, somewhere, pitied him enough to do this. He was still standing there, frozen, when Jennifer's truck pulled up the driveway. She climbed out, moving faster than he'd seen her move in months, practically running toward him. "Dad, did the bank call you?" "You knew about this." It wasn't a question. Jennifer stopped a few feet away, her expression cautious. "An attorney called me Monday. He explained what was happening. I didn't tell you because I didn't know if it was real, and I didn't want to get your hopes up." "Who is it, Jenny? Who did this?" "I don't know. The attorney won't say." "But Dad, does it matter? The ranch is saved. You're not losing the land." "Of course it matters," Bobby's voice rose, anger and confusion mixing into something that felt like drowning. I don't take charity. I don't take handouts from strangers. This is wrong. It's not charity. The attorney said it was repaying an old kindness. An old kindness? What old kindness is worth $250,000? Jennifer pulled out her phone, showing him a business card she'd photographed. Walter Montgomery. He wants to meet with us. With you. He said his client wants to explain everything in person. Bobby turned away, gripping the fence post so hard a splinter drove into his palm. He barely felt it. I should refuse it. Tell them to take their money back. And then what? Jennifer's voice sharpened. You lose the ranch? You lose everything Grandpa and Great-Grandpa built? You're willing to let pride destroy 3 generations of legacy? It's not about pride, it's about integrity. A man stands on his own. Dad, stop. Jennifer moved around to face him, forcing him to meet her eyes. Just stop with this "a man stands on his own" garbage. You taught me that community matters, that helping each other is what makes us human. You told me about Grandpa giving people work during hard times, about how our family has always been there for neighbors. But somehow, when someone tries to do the same for you, it's charity? It's shameful? That's different. How? How is it different? Bobby didn't have an answer that made sense, even to himself. He just knew that accepting this felt like admitting defeat, like proving he'd failed so completely that strangers had to rescue him. Meet with the attorney, Jennifer pressed. Listen to what he has to say, then decide. But Dad, at least give whoever this is the chance to explain before you throw away the ranch out of stubbornness. Bobby looked past his daughter to the land stretching beyond the fence. His grandfather's land, his father's land, his land. The legacy he'd been so terrified of losing. One meeting, he finally said. I'll listen, but I'm not promising anything beyond that. Jennifer let out a breath she'd been holding. Thank you. I'll call Mr. Montgomery and set something up. As she walked back to her truck, phone already to her ear, Bobby pulled the splinter from his palm and watched blood well up in the small wound. Physical pain was simple, straightforward. You could see it, treat it, heal from it. The pain of accepting help when you'd spent a lifetime believing you shouldn't need it? That was a different kind of hurt entirely. That evening, David Harrison's truck pulled off Highway 87 and onto the familiar county road leading to the ranch. He'd left Houston at 4 in the morning, trying to beat traffic, and the 6-hour drive had given him far too much time to think. The hill country looked exactly as he remembered. The same rolling hills, the same stubborn live oaks, the same wide sky that seemed bigger than it had any right to be. Nostalgia hit him like a wave. Not all good, but powerful nonetheless. This land was in his bones, whether he wanted to admit it or not. He almost turned around 3 times. But Jennifer's text message stayed at the forefront of his mind. He needs both of us right now. David pulled into the familiar driveway just as the sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink. The farmhouse looked smaller than in his memories, more worn down. The barn needed painting. Several outbuildings that had stood during his childhood were gone, leaving only concrete foundations and ghosts. His father stood on the porch, backlit by the interior lights, and David felt 8 years of absence collapse into a single moment of recognition. Bobby Harrison looked older, grayer, thinner than the man David had left behind during that midnight argument. David climbed out of his truck slowly, suddenly unsure of everything. What did you say to your father after 8 years of silence? How did you bridge a gap that had grown so wide? Bobby descended the porch steps, moving with the stiffness of someone whose body had absorbed decades of hard physical labor. Father and son stopped about 10 feet apart, the space between them filled with everything they hadn't said. "David." "Dad." The silence stretched. Then Bobby said, "You look good. City life suits you." "Thanks. You look—" David trailed off, unable to find polite words for how exhausted and beaten down his father looked. "You look like you've been through hell." Something flickered across Bobby's face. Might have been humor. Might have been pain. "That's about right." Jennifer appeared in the doorway, relief flooding her features. "David! You came!" She bounded down the steps and wrapped her brother in a fierce hug. David held her tight, surprised by how much he'd missed her. They'd texted occasionally over the years, brief exchanges about holidays and birthdays, but it wasn't the same as seeing her in person. "Hey, Jenny," he murmured into her hair. "You didn't give me much choice." "Good. You both needed me to be pushy." She pulled back, looking between her father and brother. "Come inside. I made dinner. We have a lot to talk about." The farmhouse interior was a museum of David's childhood. The same furniture, the same photos on the walls, the same worn rug in the hallway. His mother's presence was everywhere. In the curtains she'd sewn, the piano she'd played, the kitchen that had been her domain. Her absence was equally present, a space that couldn't be filled. They ate Jennifer's pot roast in awkward silence at first, years of distance making conversation feel like navigating a minefield. But slowly, carefully, words began to flow. "So, you're some kind of manager now?" Bobby asked, his tone neutral. "Regional manager for Langford Oil and Gas," David confirmed. "I oversee operations in the Southeast Texas region." "That's good. Honest work." "It's work," David said. "Not sure I'd call it honest. Mostly it's conference calls and spreadsheets." "But you like it?" David considered the question honestly. "It pays well. I'm good at it." "Is that the same as liking it?" "I don't know." Bobby nodded slowly, pushing food around his plate. "Your mother always said you were smart with numbers. Smarter than me." "I learned from watching you manage the ranch finances," David said, the words surprising him. "You always knew exactly where every dollar was going. That's a skill." It was the first almost compliment they'd exchanged in years, and it hung in the air between them, fragile and tentative. Jennifer cleared her throat. "So I told David about the foreclosure and about the mysterious benefactor who paid it off." David looked at his father sharply. "Jenny said you're thinking about refusing the money?" "I haven't decided anything yet," Bobby said defensively. "Dad, that's insane. Someone just saved the ranch. Why would you refuse that?" "Because I don't know who they are or why they did it. Because accepting money from strangers isn't how we do things." "How you do things was about to lose the ranch," David said bluntly. "Maybe it's time to do things differently." Bobby's jaw tightened, and Jennifer quickly intervened. "There's a meeting set up for Friday. Mr. Montgomery, the attorney, will be there, and apparently his client, the person who paid the debt, wants to meet Dad in person to explain everything." "Then go to the meeting," David said, forcing his tone to stay reasonable. "Hear them out. Worst case, you say no, and we figure out a different solution." "What different solution?" Bobby asked bitterly. "There is no different solution. I've exhausted every option. The money's gone, the cattle are gone, the equipment's gone. This mystery benefactor is literally the only thing standing between this family and losing everything." "Then accept it," David said simply. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" "Because—" Bobby stopped, the words catching in his throat. "Because I'm 58 years old, and I've spent my whole life believing that a man takes care of his own problems, that asking for help is weakness, that accepting charity is shameful, and now I'm supposed to just throw all that away? Maybe those beliefs were wrong, David said quietly. Maybe that's why we fought 8 years ago. Because I couldn't live up to impossible standards that you couldn't live up to either. The silence that followed was heavy with years of unspoken conflict. Bobby stared at his son, seeing in David's face echoes of arguments they'd had when David was a teenager, when he was in college, during that final explosive fight before David left. "I wasn't a good father to you," Bobby finally said, his voice rough. "I know that. I pushed too hard, expected too much, tried to force you into a life you didn't want. Dad!" "Let me finish." Bobby rubbed his face tiredly. "Your mother, she understood you better than I did. She always said you needed room to find your own path. But I couldn't see it. All I could see was the legacy, the land, the responsibility. I thought if I could just make you understand how important it was, you'd want to stay." "I did want to stay," David said, his voice thick. "Part of me did. But I also wanted to be my own person, not just the next generation of Harrison ranchers. And you couldn't accept that." "No," Bobby admitted. "I couldn't. And I drove you away because of it." "That's on me, son. That's my failure." Jennifer had tears streaming down her face, her hand covering her mouth. David's eyes were bright with unshed tears of his own. "I should have called," David said. "Should have come back sooner. I was angry and stubborn, and I let 8 years go by because I was too proud to make the first move." "Sounds like you're more my son than either of us wanted to admit," Bobby said with a sad smile. They sat in the emotional aftermath, years of hurt and distance beginning to crack open. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was the first step toward it. Finally, Jennifer wiped her eyes and said, "Friday, the meeting. We all go together." "Agreed?" Bobby looked at his daughter, then his son, seeing in their faces the family he'd been too proud and hurt to fully appreciate. "Agreed," he said. Friday arrived with unseasonably warm weather. The Texas sun bright and cheerful in a way that felt incongruous with the anxiety churning in Bobby's stomach. Walter Montgomery had arranged the meeting at a private venue, a restored historic ranch house in Luckenbach, about 20 minutes from the Harrison property. Bobby, Jennifer, and David drove together in Bobby's repaired truck, the silence heavy but not uncomfortable. They were learning how to be in each other's presence again, navigating the delicate process of rebuilding what had been broken. The ranch house was beautiful, all native limestone and wide porches, surrounded by massive oak trees. A black Mercedes was already parked out front, and Bobby's nerves ratcheted up another notch. Walter Montgomery met them at the door, a distinguished man in his early 60s, wearing expensive casual clothes that marked him as someone comfortable with wealth. His handshake was firm, his smile genuine. "Mr. Harrison, such a pleasure to finally meet you in person. Ms. Harrison, Mr. David Harrison." He shook each of their hands. "Please, come in. My client is waiting inside." They entered a spacious great room with soaring ceilings and comfortable furniture arranged around a large stone fireplace. And there, standing with his back to them, looking at a collection of old photographs on the wall, was a man whose silhouette was instantly recognizable. He turned around, and Bobby's breath caught in his chest. George Strait smiled, his famous face carrying a few more lines than it had 48 years ago, but still unmistakably the same person who'd worked on the Harrison Ranch in 1977. "Hello, Bobby," George said quietly. "It's been a long time." Bobby Harrison stood frozen in the great room, his mind struggling to reconcile the image before him with reality. George Strait, the George Strait, the king of country music, looking at him with an expression that carried equal parts nostalgia and determination. "George?" Bobby's voice came out rough, disbelieving. "What? How? Surprise doesn't quite cover it, does it?" George moved forward, extending his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Bobby shook it, feeling calluses that reminded him this man, despite the fame and fortune, still understood physical work. Jennifer and David exchanged confused glances, not yet understanding the full picture. Walter Montgomery quietly excused himself, giving them privacy. "Maybe we should sit down," George suggested, gesturing to the comfortable leather furniture arranged near the fireplace. "I imagine you have questions." "Questions?" Bobby let out a laugh that sounded slightly unhinged. "George, I haven't heard from you in over 20 years. And now you show up saying you've paid off $250,000 in debt? That's beyond questions. That's completely insane?" George finished, a small smile playing at his lips. "Yeah, I reckon it is. But let me explain, and maybe it'll make a little more sense." They sat, Bobby on the edge of the couch, like he might bolt at any moment, Jennifer and David flanking him, George in the armchair across from them. Through the windows, the Texas hill country stretched in all its rugged beauty, the same landscape that had shaped both men's lives. "I heard about your situation about 3 weeks ago," George began. "I stay in touch with folks around Fredericksburg and the hill country. Charles Whitmore, you know Charlie, of course. He mentioned it to Jerry Patterson, who used to play guitar in Ace in the Hole back in the day. Jerry called me, told me what was happening with the ranch." Bobby shook his head. "George, you can't just—" "Let me finish," George said gently but firmly. "Please, I need you to understand something. Back in 1977, I was nobody. Just another guy with a guitar and a dream, playing dive bars for beer money and tips. I was working odd jobs, barely keeping gas in my truck, and Nashville seemed as far away as the moon." He leaned forward, his expression intense with memory. "Then, one night at the Armadillo in San Marcos, after a show, a young rancher bought me a beer. We talked for hours about music, about life, about what it meant to chase something impossible. And that rancher, you, Bobby, you did something crazy. You offered me real work, good money, and a place to stay. It wasn't charity," Bobby said quietly. "You earned every dollar." "I know I did. You worked me hard," George said with a genuine laugh. "I learned more about cattle ranching in those 6 months than I ever wanted to know. But Bobby, it wasn't just the work. You treated me like family. Your parents, God rest their souls, they fed me at their table. Your mom made sure I had clean clothes. Your dad taught me how to fix fence posts and birth calves. You gave me stability when my life was chaos." Jennifer reached over and squeezed her father's hand, beginning to understand. "And then, when I was ready to go to Nashville," George continued, "you gave me $3,000. In 1977, that was a fortune. You said it was a loan, but we both knew it wasn't. It was an investment in someone else's dream. You believed in me when you had no real reason to, and that belief made all the difference. You would have made it anyway," Bobby said. "You had the talent. Maybe. But talent without opportunity is just potential that dies frustrated. You gave me the opportunity." George's voice grew thick with emotion. "Bobby, I've spent 47 years being successful beyond anything I could have imagined. I've sold records, played stadiums, earned more money than I'll ever spend. But I've never forgotten where I came from, and I've never forgotten the people who helped me get there. I never asked for anything back. I know. That's exactly why I'm here." George stood, moving to the window, his hands in his pockets. "About 15 years ago, I started looking into what happened to people from my early days. The folks who helped me, believed in me, gave me chances. I found out your wife Linda had passed. I'm sorry I didn't reach out then. I should have." "You were busy living your life," Bobby said. "That's not an excuse. I should have been better about staying in touch." George turned back to face them. When Jerry called me 3 weeks ago, told me you were losing the ranch, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Here was this man who'd helped me at a crucial moment, facing the loss of everything he held dear, and I'd been too caught up in my own world to even know. He moved back to his chair, sitting forward with his elbows on his knees. Bobby, that $3,000 you gave me in 1978, with inflation and appreciation, it's worth about $15,000 today. But the real value, the stability, the belief, the kindness, that's immeasurable. I'm not paying off your debt out of charity. I'm settling an account that's been open for 47 years. $250,000 is a lot more than $3,000, even with inflation, Bobby said. But his voice had lost its defensive edge. Is it? George challenged. What's the value of believing in someone's dream? What's the value of giving them the foundation to take a chance? If you hadn't helped me, Bobby, my whole life would have been different. Maybe I'd have made it eventually. Maybe not. But I sure as hell wouldn't have made it the way I did when I did. Everything I've built traces back to that moment when you decided to help a struggling musician for no reason other than kindness. David spoke up for the first time. Mr. Strait, I'm David Harrison, Bobby's son. I have to ask, and please don't take this the wrong way, but why now? Why not help sooner if you knew about Mom's death, about the ranch struggling? That's a fair question. George looked at David with respect. Honestly, pride works both ways. I kept thinking Bobby would reach out if he needed help. I didn't want to intrude or presume. And I suspect your father was too proud to ask. We're Texas ranchers, both of us. We're stubborn as hell, even when stubbornness hurts us. He glanced at Bobby with a rueful smile. It took Jerry's phone call telling me the foreclosure was imminent to break through my own pride and make me realize I couldn't wait for Bobby to ask. Some things are too important to let pride get in the way. Jennifer, who'd been quietly crying, said, "Thank you for all of this, for caring enough to help, even after so many years." "Don't thank me yet," George said. "Your father hasn't agreed to accept the help." All eyes turned to Bobby, who sat with his hands clasped, staring at the floor. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Finally, Bobby looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but dry. "I've spent the past 3 weeks hating myself," he said quietly. "Hating that I failed. Hating that I couldn't protect what my father and grandfather built. Hating that I was too proud to ask for help when I needed it. And most of all, hating that I'd become exactly the kind of man who'd rather lose everything than admit weakness." He looked at George. "You remember my father?" "I do. Good man. Tough, but fair. He taught me that a man stands on his own, that asking for help is failure, that accepting charity is shameful. I've lived by those rules my entire life, George. They're woven into who I am." Bobby paused, emotion working in his jaw. "But this past week, I've watched my daughter work herself to exhaustion trying to save a ranch I was too proud to ask for help with. I've reconnected with my son after 8 years of stubborn silence because I was too proud to admit I was wrong. And now you're sitting here, telling me that something I did decades ago, something I did without expecting anything in return, meant enough to you that you're willing to save everything I love." He stood, moving to the window where George had stood minutes before. "My father taught me a lot of good things, but he was wrong about pride. Pride that keeps you from accepting love, from accepting help, from accepting grace. That's not strength. That's just another kind of weakness." Bobby turned to face George. "I can't pay you back. Not in money, probably not in any meaningful way. I'm not asking you to. I know. That's what makes this so hard. Bobby's voice cracked. Accepting something this big, this generous, without being able to repay it, it goes against everything I've believed about how the world works. But maybe that's the lesson I needed to learn. He walked over to George and extended his hand. Thank you for remembering, for caring, for being the kind of man who pays forward kindness. I accept your help, and I'll spend whatever time I have left making sure this ranch honors what you've done. George stood and gripped Bobby's hand firmly, then pulled him into a hug. Two Texas ranchers, separated by decades and vastly different life paths, connected by a moment of generosity that had echoed across time. When they separated, both men had tears streaming down their faces, neither ashamed to show them. Jennifer and David joined them, and for several minutes, the four of them stood together in that sun-filled room, the weight of the past weeks finally lifting. Walter Montgomery discreetly returned, carrying a folder of documents. Gentlemen, ladies, I have the paperwork here. Bobby, if you're ready, we can make this official. The next hour was spent reviewing documents, signing papers, and finalizing the transfer. Walter explained that the debt had been satisfied in full. All penalties and fees cleared. The Harrison Ranch belonged to the Harrison family, free and clear, for the first time in 30 years. There is one condition, George said as they finished the paperwork. Not a legal one, just a personal request. Bobby looked up warily. What kind of condition? Don't let pride keep you isolated anymore. George said seriously. Let your neighbors help when you need it. Let your kids be part of your life. Let people in, Bobby. This ranch should be filled with family and friends and life, not just one stubborn man carrying the weight of 3 generations alone. Bobby glanced at David, then Jennifer, seeing the hope in their faces. I can do that, he said. I want to do that. Good. George smiled. Because I'd like to visit sometime, if you're willing. Maybe bring my guitar. Play some music in that barn like the old days. I miss the simplicity of those times. You're always welcome, Bobby said, meaning it completely. Anytime. As they prepared to leave, Jennifer pulled George aside. Mr. Strait, I teach elementary school in Fredericksburg. The kids would absolutely lose their minds if you ever wanted to visit. Maybe talk to them about following dreams, working hard, being kind. I know you're busy, but I'd love to, George interrupted. Seriously, have your principal call my manager. We'll set something up. Jennifer's face lit up with pure joy. The kids are going to freak out. Thank you. David approached more cautiously. Mr. Strait, I just want to say, what you did for my dad, for our family, it means more than I can express. You didn't just save a ranch. You saved relationships that were broken. You gave us a chance to be a family again. George clasped David's shoulder. Sometimes the most valuable thing we can give someone is the space to heal and rebuild. Your father's a good man who got lost for a while. We all do. What matters is finding your way back. The drive home was quiet, but this time the silence was comfortable, contemplative. Bobby drove with one hand on the wheel, the other held by Jennifer in the passenger seat. David sat in the back, watching the hill country roll past the windows. Dad, David finally said, as they pulled into the ranch driveway, I've been thinking. I could work remotely a few days a week. Maybe come out on weekends, help with the ranch. I'm not saying I want to ranch full-time, but I'd like to be part of this again, if you want me here. Bobby put the truck in park and turned to look at his son. David, I would love nothing more. This land is your heritage too, whether you ranch it or not. It's yours and Jenny's, and someday, if you have kids, it'll be theirs. You're always welcome here. Always. That night, they grilled steaks on the porch and sat around the old picnic table under the stars, talking and laughing in a way they hadn't in years. Bobby told stories about George working on the ranch, about his terrible fence-mending skills that improved over time, about the night he'd played guitar for Bobby's parents and made his mother cry with a ballad about missing home. "I can't believe you never told us Dad knew George Strait," David said, shaking his head. "That's the coolest thing ever." "It didn't seem important," Bobby said. "He was just George back then, a friend who needed help. The fame came later. But you must have been so proud, watching him become this huge star," Jennifer said. Bobby considered this. "I was. But I was also just happy he got to live his dream. That's what mattered. The success was bonus." As midnight approached, Jennifer headed home to her apartment, and David settled into his old bedroom, which Bobby had left exactly as it had been 8 years ago. Bobby sat alone on the porch for a while, looking out at the land that had defined his entire life. He thought about his grandfather, who'd built the original farmhouse with his bare hands after returning from World War II. He thought about his father, who'd expanded the ranch and raised cattle through boom times and bust times with equal determination. He thought about his mother, whose garden had fed not just their family, but half the neighbors during lean years. And he thought about Linda, his wife, who'd understood him better than he'd understood himself, who'd loved this land almost as much as he did, but had never let it become more important than people. "I almost lost it all, Linda," he whispered to the night. "Almost let pride destroy everything we built together. But I think I'm finally learning what you tried to teach me, that accepting help doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." The stars offered no response, but Bobby felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. The ranch was saved. His children were home. His pride, which had been a prison, was finally crumbling into something more like humility. And somewhere out there, a country music legend was probably in his own home, feeling good about paying forward a kindness that had meant more than anyone could have calculated. 3 months later, the Harrison Ranch looked transformed, though not in ways a casual observer might immediately notice. The same weathered barn stood in the same place. The same ancient live oaks marked the property boundaries. The same farmhouse sat at the end of the gravel driveway. But life had returned to the ranch in ways both visible and subtle. Bobby stood in the southern pasture on a crisp February morning, watching as David worked alongside 2 of Charles Whitmore's ranch hands to repair a water line. His son came out every weekend now, sometimes staying through Monday when he could work remotely. He'd never be a full-time rancher, but he'd reconnected with the land in a way that brought Bobby quiet joy. Jennifer's truck was parked by the house, as it was most mornings before she headed to school. She'd started having breakfast with Bobby every day. Their relationship rebuilt on the foundation of honesty they'd established that day at Luckenbach. The ranch was still operating on a shoestring budget, but it was operating. Bobby had used some of the money saved from debt payments to reinvest in the herd, buying young cattle from a neighboring ranch at a fair price. He'd joined a cooperative with other small ranchers, pooling resources for better market access. And he'd started actually accepting help when neighbors offered it, slowly learning that community worked both ways. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from George Strait. "Still on for next Saturday?" Bringing the guitar. Bobby smiled and typed back, "Looking forward to it. Jenny's making her grandmother's tamales." The friendship had rekindled naturally over the past months. They'd talked on the phone several times, long conversations that picked up threads from 47 years ago and wove them into the present. George had visited once in January, staying for an entire afternoon, playing music in the barn, while a handful of neighbors gathered to listen. It had been magical, intimate, nothing like the stadiums George usually played, but perhaps more meaningful because of that. "Dad!" David called from the pasture. "We got the line fixed. Water's flowing again." Bobby waved acknowledgement and headed down to inspect the work. David was dirty, sweaty, and grinning, looking more like the boy who'd grown up on this ranch than the polished executive he'd become. "Good work," Bobby said, examining the connection. "That'll hold." "Charlie's guys really know their stuff," David said, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. "They taught me 3 different techniques just this morning." "You're picking it up quick. Natural talent." David laughed. "I wouldn't go that far, but I'm remembering things I thought I'd forgotten. It's like muscle memory, working with my hands again." They walked back toward the house together, father and son comfortable in each other's company, in a way that had seemed impossible just months before. "I've been thinking," David said as they approached the barn. "Rachel and I are getting serious. I'd like to bring her out here soon. Show her where I'm from. Think you'd be okay with that?" "I'd love to meet her," Bobby said warmly. "Any woman who puts up with you must be something special." "She is. And Dad, I want her to understand this part of my life. The ranch, the history, the family. I spent so many years trying to pretend I wasn't connected to this place. But that was stupid. This land made me who I am, for better or worse." Bobby stopped, looking at his son with pride. "You're a better man than I was at your age, David. You figured out how to be your own person, while still honoring where you came from. I tried to force you into a mold, and that was wrong. But you found your own path, and it's a good one. I learned from your mistakes," David said with a gentle smile, "and from your strengths. Both were valuable lessons." Inside the house, Jennifer had coffee brewing and was scrolling through her phone at the kitchen table. "Oh my God, you guys need to see this." She turned her phone toward them. George Strait's official Instagram account showed a photo from his January visit to the ranch. George, with his guitar, Bobby, Jennifer, and David, all sitting on hay bales in the barn, surrounded by a handful of neighbors. The caption read, "Some of the best music happens in the quietest places, with the truest friends. Thanks to the Harrison family for reminding me where I came from and what really matters. Hill country, roots music, I'll pay it forward." The post had over 2 million likes and thousands of comments. "Jenny, why didn't you tell me he posted this?" Bobby asked. "It just went up an hour ago." "Dad, look at the comments. People are asking about the ranch, about you, about what the story is." Bobby scrolled through a few comments, feeling overwhelmed. "This is too much attention." "It's good attention," Jennifer countered. "Look, 3 different people have asked if we do ranch tours or farm-to-table experiences. That could be a revenue stream we haven't even considered. I'm not turning this place into a tourist attraction. Not a tourist attraction. An educational experience. People want to understand where their food comes from, want to connect with authentic ranching culture. We could do occasional workshops, maybe partner with the school district for field trips." David nodded thoughtfully. "She's right, Dad. Agritourism is huge right now. And it's not selling out. It's sharing knowledge, preserving culture. Think about it." Bobby poured himself coffee, considering. A few months ago, he would have rejected the idea outright, seeing it as commercializing something that should remain pure and private. But he was learning to see possibilities instead of just threats. "I'll think about it," he said, which Jennifer correctly interpreted as progress. The following Saturday, George arrived at noon in a pickup truck rather than the Mercedes, wearing jeans and a work shirt, looking like any other hill country rancher. He brought his guitar, some fresh peaches from his own property, and stories that had them all laughing within minutes. They spent the afternoon the way friends do, working a little, talking a lot, eating Jennifer's tamales on the porch while the winter sun warmed the land. George played music, both his famous hits and older songs from his struggling years, filling the ranch with melodies that felt like they'd always belonged there. "You know what I miss most about those early days?" George said during a break between songs. "The simplicity. Don't get me wrong, I'm grateful for every bit of success I've had. But there was something pure about playing music just because you loved it, working hard just because work needed doing, helping someone just because it was right. You can still have that," Bobby said. "You're doing it right now." "I know. That's why I keep coming back." George strummed absently. "Bobby, I've been thinking about setting up a foundation, something to help small ranchers and farmers who are struggling, provide low-interest loans or grants, maybe connect them with resources. Would you be willing to be part of that? Help me understand what kind of help actually helps?" Bobby was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "I'd be honored. On one condition." "What's that?" "We also focus on helping young artists who are where you were in 1977. Musicians, artists, people with talent and dreams, but not much else. Create a program that pairs them with folks who can offer stability while they chase their goals." George's face lit up. "Bobby, that's brilliant. Full circle." "Everything's a circle if you live long enough," Bobby said. "Might as well make it a good one." As evening approached, Charles Whitmore and his wife stopped by, along with a few other neighbors who'd heard George was visiting. What started as a small gathering organically became a gathering, people bringing food and drinks, kids running around the property, someone producing a fiddle, another a harmonica. Impromptu music broke out in the barn, George playing alongside local musicians, everyone trading songs and stories. Bobby found himself in the middle of it all, surrounded by community, family, and friends, feeling more alive than he had in years. At one point, Jennifer pulled him aside, both of them watching the celebration from the porch. "This is what the ranch should always be," she said softly, "full of people and life and joy, not just a burden you carry alone." "I'm learning that," Bobby said, his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "Slowly, but I'm learning. I'm proud of you, Dad, for accepting help, for letting David back in, for changing. I know how hard that is." "Not as hard as the alternative," Bobby admitted. "Losing everything would have been harder. Losing you and David would have been harder. Pride's a heavy weight, Jenny. I'm just glad I figured out how to put it down before it crushed me completely." David appeared with his phone raised. "Hey, family photo! Come on, get together." Bobby, Jennifer, and David grouped together on the porch, the barn and celebration visible behind them. George photobombed at the last second, jumping into frame with a grin. The picture captured them all mid-laugh, genuine joy frozen in pixels. Later, after most people had gone home and the last notes of music had faded, Bobby walked George to his truck. They stood in the driveway under a sky full of stars, two old friends connected by time and kindness. "Thank you," Bobby said simply, "for everything, for remembering, for caring, for saving my family's legacy." "Thank you for giving me something worth remembering," George replied. "Bobby, what you did for me in 1977, you didn't just help me financially. You showed me that people could be good, that kindness existed without strings attached. That shaped how I've tried to live my life ever since. So really, I'm just paying forward what you started." They shook hands, then embraced. The kind of hug that holds decades of gratitude and respect. "Don't be a stranger," Bobby said. "You're always welcome here. This is your home too, in a way." "I'll be back," George promised. "Maybe bring some of my grandkids. Let them see what real ranch work looks like. As George's truck disappeared down the driveway, Bobby stood alone under the stars, feeling the weight of the land beneath his feet. Not as a burden this time, but as a gift. 3 generations of Harrisons had worked this soil, and now, thanks to an unexpected circle of kindness, future generations would have the chance to continue that legacy. He thought about how close he'd come to losing everything, how pride had nearly destroyed what love had built. He thought about his children, both home now in their own ways, rebuilding the relationships he'd almost thrown away. He thought about community, friendship, and the mysterious ways kindness could echo across decades. The ranch house glowed with warm light behind him. Inside, Jennifer and David were cleaning up, their voices and laughter carrying on the night air. His children, his land, his legacy, all saved not by his own strength, but by accepting grace when it was offered. Bobby Harrison was 58 years old, a 4th-generation Texas rancher who'd learned the hardest lesson of his life, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you need help, that accepting generosity doesn't diminish you, it connects you to the best parts of being human. He looked up at the vast Texas sky, at stars that had witnessed countless generations of dreamers and workers, failures and successes, pride and humility. "Thank you," he whispered to the universe, to George, to his ancestors, to whatever force had seen fit to give him a second chance. "I won't waste it." And then Bobby Harrison, rancher, father, friend, walked back into his house, into the light and laughter of family, leaving the darkness and isolation behind him forever. The Harrison Ranch would stand for generations to come, not because one man had fought to save it alone, but because he'd finally learned to let others help him carry the weight. And that lesson, more than the land itself, would be the true legacy he'd pass on to his children. Some debts can never be fully repaid. Some kindnesses echo far beyond their original intention. And sometimes, the greatest gift we can receive is the grace to accept what we don't deserve, but desperately need. This was the story of such a gift, and the 2 men, connected by time, by music, by a moment of generosity in 1977, who understood that the best measure of success isn't what you achieve, but who you help along the way.